Thank you, Dr. Schmitz, for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here with a group of people who are looking towards the future and seeing what they can do today, in the present, to make it better. That was precisely the mandate that the Reflection Group on the Future of Europe received way back in December 2007, when it looked that the European Union would have finally have managed to get over the crisis caused by 2 vetoes on the constitutional treaty, and was in the expectation of the Lisbon Treaty being rapidly adopted and put into effect. However, seeing the situation in Ireland, the group, in a way, was asked to sort of put the brakes on its activities. We had a president, Felipe González, who had been 4 times elected the Prime Minister of Spain after all those years of dictatorship under Franco. So here was a man who had been involved in seeing his country pass from a very long totalitarian regime, single-party regime, to democracy. We had, as vice chairman of the group, Jorma Ollila, who had been leading Nokia during that period of its spectacular growth as a multinational, and is now a CEO of Shell, which is not exactly small potatoes either. And then I was also appointed as another vice chairman of the group, and we were appointed by the European Council, in other words, by the group of European heads of state and government, with a mandate of co-opting, as it were, other members into this group, but not 1 member per country, most definitely not. It should be an independent group of independent thinkers, independent personalities. We worked for nearly a year on the selection process, proposed a list to the European Council, which was adopted, and the group, in fact, has been working for something like 18 months, very intensively, with regular meetings in Brussels, a lot of consultations, and has just deposited its report on the 8th of May. It has been presented by Felipe González to Mr. Herman Van Rompuy as President of the European Council. We hope that the European Council will consider and report back on it at its June meeting. In other words, that they will receive it and possibly will get some sort of comment. I thought that it would be appropriate at this juncture then to talk to you about the sorts of preoccupations that we, as a group of independent individuals, not representing any government, not representing any particular body, just as a group of 12 Europeans with a broad variety of different experiences, how we saw the challenges that Europe faces today and what we think it should be doing in order to cope in the somewhat longer horizon, 2020 to 2030, in other words, 10 or 20 years down the road from today. I think I might also take advantage of the experience I gained last year when the Commissioner for Science and Research asked me to chair a group to evaluate the European Research Council, which had been established in 2005 and had just really been operating for around 2.5 years at the time we evaluated it. Since your group is also interested in education and research, I thought that it would be appropriate to remind you of some of the conclusions of that group as well. details and concrete details, and both these reports are publicly available. You can find them on the web pages both of the European Commission and of the European Council. Reflection Group on the Future of Europe, a report. We try to make it as brief as possible, and the report on the evaluation of the Research Council, the European Research Council, which was deposited last summer and received, I must say, a very good reception, was widely supported both within the scientific community and the Commission itself, and the Commission has already committed itself under the previous Swedish presidency to follow through on the main recommendations on our report. 2010 is an anniversary year for a number of things. Latvia just celebrated 20 years since the declaration of the renewal of its independence. It coincides with fairly closely with a whole series of anniversaries of the same type elsewhere in Europe. The year before, we celebrated the fall of the Wall of Berlin. We have commemorated the start of the Second World War, sad occasions during which I had occasion to participate in various events in Poland. The three Baltic nations marked 2010 as the 20th anniversary of their renewed determination to recover their independence, which fortunately they were able to do thanks to the singing revolutions and with hardly any bloodshed, which is unusual in itself. And just this last weekend, on the 8th and 9th of May, we celebrated 60 years on the 9th of May of Schumann's declaration, the declaration deposited by Robert Schuman. He sprung it like a rabbit out of a hat, put it before the French government 60 years ago on the 3rd of May, and six days later, on the 9th, the French government had accepted it, and the acceptation of this declaration became basically the cornerstone, the founding stone of the construction of that European Union in which we live today, and about which we had been reflecting how it might develop in the future, in which many of those here present will be members or close partners and neighbors to it. So I think that even to our closest neighbors and partners, of course, the fate of the European Union is not of small interest. A few words about the Schuman Declaration. We must remember the context into which it took place. Europe of the time was absolutely in ruins. The region from which Schuman came, the borders between Luxembourg, France and Germany, and his own personal background, make it a region of frontiers, where practically every square foot of soil had been soaked in blood for about a century and a half preceding, with most importantly of all the 1870 war between France and Germany, followed by the First World War, that enormous slaughter of a whole generation of the youngest and best and brightest in Western Europe, and then of course the Second World War again. In that situation, Schuman had this visionary idea, and he had been discussing this with Jean Monnet and a small group of other concerned people about what could be done to prevent this happening again. After all, in 1918, and at the Versailles conference, people had thought we will put an end to war forever, and Europe will enter into a period of prosperity and peace. And we saw what happened. It was worse than ever 20 years later. So these things are not trivial as to how one proceeds after the end of a disaster, if you like, or a crisis, what steps one takes in order to build for the future. This is why today, when we are in the middle still of a large financial and economic crisis and recession, and with, of course, with different labels that different people will attribute to it, I think it is pertinent for us to remember the various crises that have happened in the past and what lessons we might draw from them. The situations, of course, are never the same. One cannot make direct transferences of lessons from one situation to the other, but one can learn certain principles. The first thing in the Schuman Declaration was reconciliation. The idea that one had to take steps to change the rules of the game. The attitude until then had been one of revanchism. You did this to me, so I will do that to you. You took away this territory from me, therefore I will go and grab it back and maybe take some of yours. The attitude was also that you had nations that were enemies, historical enemies, and had been for centuries, and that they had no other option. There was no other solution in sight than to continue to have military slaughters at various intervals. And for what purpose? At the end of the war, I think, especially in 1945, there were a great many Europeans who were wondering and saying, what was this all about? What did we gain out of it? Who gained anything out of it? And it was really very doubtful as to how good it had been. Of course, there had been this victory over fascism, as they put it in Russia. In fact, it had been a victory over National Socialism, mostly, with fascism as, if you like, a minor partner of Hitler's National Socialism, to be quite precise about it. But of course, there was still the other totalitarian communist regimes under the aegis of Moscow that were still in place, and so therefore there was really half of Europe that had an opportunity to change things, and half of Europe the one that went behind what became the Iron Curtain, that stayed in basically a process of stagnation and lack of change, and ultimately that led to the downfall of what appeared to be an impregnable fortress and an enormously strong empire. In Western Europe, which was absolutely in ruins, there was thus this idea of taking steps to establish lasting peace, and to do so in a way that war would become inconceivable. And the way Schuman and Monnet thought about it is to base it on economically advantageous decisions, where two sides that had been enemies would pool their resources on those prime materials, primary resources, for which the most bitter fights had happened, and which were absolutely essential for both the running of their economies and for preparing for war, namely, of course, steel and coal. Now, if you look back on the details of the arrangements that they made, you will see that, of course, this sort of thing could only happen when you had a victorious side on one side and a losing side, the Germans on the other. Unfortunately, it is doubtful how long it might have taken for the two sides to come to it without a war and to reach a similar agreement. But having had the disaster of the war, at least they took the next step. The Germans understood they didn't have very much choice, but it was the French, I think, who really took that initiative of saying, we were not really such victors after all. We have nothing to gloat about. We have really much to gain by cooperating with our neighbors and finding ways where we can put certain things in common. And this is where the community method came, right at the very beginning with the coal and steel agreement. That there would be, besides the national governments, that there would be something more neutral, some entity which became ultimately the European Commission as we know it in its present guise, this community method of putting certain things in common. And this community method became in due time then the delegation of a part of various nation states giving up a part of their sovereignty to put it in a common pot, into a common pool, where decisions would be taken in common, but then they would be binding and supersede the decisions of the national governments and parliaments. I think this is something that is very important to keep in mind. The second aspect is the economic cooperation. Of course, we must not forget the Marshall Plan and its role in economic recovery in Europe. I think this is very clear, and to some extent it is not that different from situations today. The Marshall Plan brought in capital. It brought in investment. It brought in the possibility for reconstruction, for renewal, for building things up again. It gave a push to the economies that had been absolutely destroyed. It would have taken much longer for people to accumulate wealth, to accumulate savings, and to get things going. The Americans, I think, did a brilliant thing which was advantageous to both sides here again. By helping the Europeans, they found themselves a partner. A trading partner to this day is their major trading partner. By helping the other side in need, in fact, you establish a win-win situation where both sides have something to gain from each other. Now, as you well know, the community method was expanded increasingly to other things, namely the common agricultural policy, which to this day remains a very controversial one, but that countries like France consider absolutely fundamental to the whole enterprise. And the question that we as a reflection group faced is, how far should this integration go? What does Europe, let us call it Europe for short, understanding that we're talking about this union of 27 states at the moment, members of the European Union, who are able to take decisions in common. Europe, if you like, in its normal sense, includes naturally countries like Norway and Switzerland and Iceland, who are not part of it. But I will, when I say Europe for short, I will be talking about the European Union as a shorthand. We see that Europe is on the threshold, on the cusp of very serious decisions that need to be taken right now, starting 2010, if it is to be maintaining the advantages it has today in 2020 and 2030, as well as continuing to grow and to guarantee to its populations all the advantages that it had slowly built up in the past 60 years of peace, growing economic prosperity, and growing social security for all the members of the member states, of course, continuously increasing in number by various leaps and bounds, from 6 to 12 to 15 to 25 and then to 27. The economic model that is seen as being that of Europe, you have probably heard it referred to as the soziale Wirtschaftsmodell, which the Germans introduced after the war. And we must remember that this is under conditions where the country is completely in ruins, where its ideology has failed, where it's a loser in the war, and is trying to pass from a totalitarian dictatorship to democracy, with help and foreign aid from the Marshall Plan, and the opportunity to establish, at least in Western Germany, not the eastern part, a democratic system of governance. The model, in fact, has been adopted to various degrees with various variations in other parts of Europe. You will have what some will call the Scandinavian model as being somewhat different. The Mediterranean one may be somewhat different, but essentially the principles, and you know them well, are really quite simple. It is the generation of wealth, in other words, governments taking a position of establishing peace, security, the rule of law, justice, human rights, allowing those who have the talents for it to create wealth and to produce riches, but the governments at the same time requesting, of course, the payment of taxes in return from both individuals and enterprises, and redistributing it in a socially responsible society where even if somebody is not a genius and doesn't have talent for entrepreneurship, if somebody is handicapped in one way or another, if they are struck by illness, misfortune or death in a family, they are not left behind. But this is a society where no individual should be left behind, and those who can look after those who cannot. This is an elementary and a simple model, and you might say, well, places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, certainly the United States, don't have anything all that different. In other words, it is a model that is at the basis, essentially, of all democracies, but the emphasis in Europe has always been on the line, if you like, that you draw between state intervention and absolutely the free hand of the free market operating by itself. Generally, and I think this is something that one could debate for a long time, but generally it is accepted that in America the social services provided by the government or the governments on the constituent states are not as extensive as those provided in Europe. But I can tell you that in Canada, for instance, a free health system, or if you like, a national health insurance system, has been in place for decades. And it is only now with great and unending political debate, starting with President Clinton's presidency, that the Americans have finally gotten around to having universal or more near universal health insurance, so that there is a difference in that regard. Now the question is, this what has been called as a highly competitive social market economy, that is the European social model, what are its chances of surviving in 2020 and in 2030, not to mention overcoming the present crises, both in terms of economic downturn, of fiscal disequilibrium, and deep indebtedness on the part of so many countries, and very heavy deficits for so many governments. We think that Europe will really have to pull up its socks and run very fast if it is to keep up. And our feeling was that the leaders of Europe, the political leaders, we hope that they not just read, but they ponder the implications of a report very seriously, because unless things are done and changed in Europe right now and in the next few years, Europe is doomed to fall behind for a variety of reasons. So far, its weight in world affairs, particularly in the economic scene, has been one of the largest. It's been a superpower, if you like, in terms of its economic contribution to the world economy, but many have said that it has been puny in terms of political weight. We hear, and with some reason, we hear it said that Europe is an economic giant and a political dwarf. It will be even smaller by 2030 unless it gets itself together with much more coordinated positions on energy, on security, on its economic governance, and on a common foreign policy. Not to mention closer cooperation, wherever possible, on educating its people for innovation, for creativity, and for finding solutions. Exactly the sorts of things that you and your associations and your institutions are involved in. This is the sine qua non, it is the absolute requirement for the future of Europe. Europe in 2030 will have a significant demographical problem. The proportion of people past current pension retirement ages will be so high that it's difficult to see how the proportionately smaller number of active workers in a population will be able to keep up the level to which they become accustomed to in their social security. Granted that today it is obvious that the social security, alas, that we have in Latvia is nowhere near what you may enjoy, say, across the sea in Sweden. On the average, the social security in Europe is better than in most other parts of the world, not all, but most. And there's a serious danger that by 2030, this level will have decreased rather than increasing, which is what we would have rather hoped. This will mean that Europe will have to see to doing a number of things to compensate for this. Immigration, of course, but there will never be enough immigrants really to compensate completely the downturn demographically. There would be just too many, and the continent would not be able to absorb, say, 100 million in 20 years. Not very likely. It will produce a social disequilibrium. So other solutions will have to be sought. People will have to work longer. Their active life will have to be prolonged. Retirement should not be an obligation, but a possibility of choice. People should be encouraged to remain in the workforce beyond an obligatory retirement age. Women should be encouraged and assisted in entering the workforce in larger numbers than they do in many European Union countries at the moment. They form, after all, half of the population. Why not be more active, even with their childbearing functions? A woman's childbearing years, after all, are only a small part of her whole lifespan, especially if she lives longer. So it's very serious to think about women's participation in the workforce, even if you take out a certain number of years that are devoted to childbearing and to child rearing. And most of all, and I think this is what you and your association has been concerned about for the past 8 years, is how to make Europe more productive. In other words, whatever is being done to do it better, faster, at smaller cost, and with greater profit. Elementary things, but we know both from comparative studies horizontally, if you like, between different countries and different companies, or historically in a longitudinal way. There are 100 different ways of running and managing any kind of enterprise, be it a company, be it a state-owned monopoly, of which there, by the way, we are proposing there should be fewer and fewer in the future, and be it an educational institution or be it a private household. The principles really are essentially the same. How to increase one's resources and how to manage them, how to husband one's resources in terms of the natural resources of each country, the natural resources of the continent, the natural resources of the planet, how to proceed with growth, development and prosperity without killing off the planet, without creating climate change, without dooming, as it were, the whole universe in which we live to such drastic changes that we would have no hope of doing anything about them. How to do all that while at the same time keeping all that we have acquired in previous decades with very hard work, with effort, with imagination, with creativity, and all the investment that has gone into building up our basic principles and our institutions of governance. The essential challenges will be for European Union leaders to be able to take tough decisions when they are not popular in their constituents, in their voters. We have just seen in Britain how when the population is not happy with the general situation in the country, with a very large deficit that that country suffers from, well, those in power are likely to lose it in the next elections. This is one aspect of democracy that in many ways has some negative sides to it. Democracy has the positive side that the population has its say, and if somebody really manages things badly, there's the opportunity of kicking them out, and one does not have to bear with them for 40 years until they pass on to better hunting grounds. The disadvantage of that is that politicians, of course, they're forced to look to their popularity, to the ratings of their party, and to their chances of being elected in the next elections. If you look back on, for instance, on the financial crisis arising in Greece, many will say that had the Chancellor of Germany not had regional elections coming up, she might have taken a more proactive a more stance with more solidarity in it, would have insisted of immediate reaction from the Eurozone before, in fact, actually getting the markets all nervous, getting the speculators like sharks smelling blood cruising around the exchange rate of the euro, and in fact creating a big scare not just within Greece but Spain, Portugal, and the whole Eurozone as a whole. As it so happens, you can see that Mrs. Merkel was right. The CDU did lose in the regional elections because it is not popular in Germany for Germany to be bailing out the Greeks, who obviously have been living beyond their means for any number of years, who have been cheating on their taxes, who have been cheating on the figures, whose governments have been cheating in presenting the statistics about the performance of the economy of their country. Well, one of the conclusions from that, among many others, is that in the Eurozone, for instance, which 10 years ago some doubted about its usefulness, and then as it established itself as a second currency in the world, it became obvious that this was a smart move for countries to pool, smaller countries to pool their resources in the modern world and to have a common currency, but that common currency was based on criteria of admittance, of the Maastricht criteria that countries had to fulfill in order to join it. But there was absolutely no mechanism for ensuring that they actually stuck to them once they were in. And Greece is a flagrant example of that, but I fear possibly not the only one, and we know certainly with the deficits that the Eurozone countries have had in recent years. There's any number of countries that have not stuck to the Maastricht criteria, which they demand from the new members. This is going to be a crucial problem for the European Union of the next 10, 20, and even 30 years if it is not fixed sooner. And our group hopes that it will be tackled really, let's say, within the next few years. This is something that should be on the agenda very seriously. If you're going to have such a thing as, for instance, a monetary union, then you must have some sort of economic governance pooled in common as well. Just as you have sovereignty delegated on the other questions, such as the common agricultural policy, you must have some economic coordination if a common monetary policy and a common fiscal policy is to be developed and to bear fruit in the way that it did when the sun was shining and things were going well, but that collapses when an unexpected crisis hits. And of course, we can never be sure that another crisis will not hit us sometime in the future. It does seem to be a fact of economic growth that it goes in cycles, and the best one can hope for is that this sigmoid curve does not have dips that go too deeply down. For decades, everybody was sure that the 1929 depression would never occur again and that we'd learn the lessons from it, and we now learned in 2008 that in fact you could actually do worse in many ways than in 1929. So that economically, in terms of all the economic models and predictions, they were absolutely unable to predict this happening, nor are they able now to predict when the next one will hit. So in many ways what one has to do is to build up cushions to protect oneself against these very painful falls, and of course try and see and draw lessons from what went wrong in the previous phase of development. I think to stay still with this economic process, one of the aspects here is that national states, the classical nation state of the, as we know it since the 19th century, is really in many ways unable to control everything that happens in a globalized economy. This is why all the more in countries that have decided on enhanced cooperation as the European Union allows in its treaties, and which was exploited and used in the case of forming the common currency zone, they must then have a common governance mechanisms if the thing is to work. I think the reason Lehman Brothers failed and the whole, if you like, domino effect was put in place and started is that worldwide on a global stage there were really some serious difficulties in both financial forecasting, in the principles of international finance, and indeed my personal opinion is on the principles underlying our conception of what constitutes economic growth. I think that the idea that economic growth should be rising in an exponential curve from one year to the next, that each year the growth should be accelerating, that profits should be increasing and so on ad infinitum, is unrealistic. We live in a world of physical limitations. There's no physical or biological or chemical process that goes on ad infinitum, constantly increasing. All our bodily rhythms go in cycles. The yearly, seasonal and natural cycles also are cyclical in nature. You never have anything growing forever, even if it's a sequoia and takes several thousand of years to grow. Ultimately, it will die and perish. So this idea that something that we are building our whole societies on the notion of continuous growth for which no end is in sight, and which is now creeping back into the public parlance and into general policy papers, I think there's something philosophically, fundamentally wrong with it. I think what we should be aiming for is states of equilibrium where growth is possible at the same time as you understand that there's a certain amount of decline. It's like that African legend where apparently God told the first men that they had this choice. They might have children and perpetuate their race, but then they must accept to die. If they wanted to remain eternal, then they would never have children. And so the first humans decided they accepted to die, but that gave them the privilege of having children. I think in our economic models we also must have this firm sense of our limitations, of things that we never will be doing or that we should not be doing. And that sense of satiety, which of course in our society with its emphasis on consumerism is one of the difficulties, and addictions of every sort are a clinical example of it. In a society that constantly advertises better foods at every season of the year and having more of them, people, you might have guessed under those circumstances, increasingly have a problem with obesity. This was not a problem when there were scarcities of food or when people performed heavy labor. When people seek pleasure and their society provides them with enough comfort and ease to be looking for not just entertainment but maybe strong feelings. Well, some of them do mountain climbing and some do bungee jumping, but others indulge in games of chance where they may lose everything they own and put their families in peril, and other addictive and harmful behaviors. The philosophy then, I think, of how we see our future societies is something that after a crisis such as we have been having and continue to have in some countries, and that is still even coming in others, granted that other countries are already recovering, this is a good opportunity to rethink the fundamental premises on which we have been basing our general philosophy. In our reflection group report, we re-emphasize that the values on which the European Union was built, in other words, peace and prosperity and security for its people, the rule of law and human rights, and the opportunity for every individual to develop to the fullest of their potential. These are things that took centuries to develop, in fact, several millennia of European civilization. These are precious values that need to be kept and that we must protect them as much as we can. But a great many other things, I think, must be re-evaluated. We must re-evaluate, for instance, the role of credit rating as agencies as determinants of the security of investments. I think that even though people have been getting the Nobel Prizes in economics, which in fact were not established by Nobel, by the way, but by the Swedish Bank Association, these Nobel so-called prizes in economics, and I had the occasion of being at the Ambrosetti seminar last summer, and where we had these people from the University of Chicago being very proud of all these models of derivative financial instruments that they had developed. Very clever, very profitable to those who put them in effect and maintained the bubble before it burst. But I think of the not just hundreds of thousands, but millions of people whose lives and futures and the education of their children have been compromised because of these very clever instruments that a handful of people developed, that basically look at the whole population of Iceland being taken hostage by, what, half a dozen dishonest bankers. It's basically, it's an outrage when you think of it. So I think there are a number of things that we have to think about. Credit agencies that gave AAA ratings to absolutely dubious mortgage-based loans that had absolutely no security to back them up. And then you discover that, of course, there were various personal and conflict of interest links between the companies, the financial institutions rated, and the rating agencies themselves. You look at the mathematical models on which economists base their predictions, and like von Hayek already did them back in 1974 when he received in turn this economic Nobel Prize. When looking at these models, you discover that they are full of parameters that are not based on observation. These are empty mathematical models where the input of rational, raw empirical data is actually minimal, and where, of course, the margin for error in predictability is extremely large. By the way, one of the things missing in such models is a better understanding of psychology and of social psychology and of the general climate in societies and the cultural values of that societies. And this is what I think for those among you who are involved both in the business of producing educational materials or connected with educational institutions that teach, say, management principles and business and economic principles, I think it's absolutely crucial and essential that in such institutions your students have elementary knowledge about social psychology, about social anthropology, about a variety of the social sciences, not to mention philosophy and the humanities, which remain a basic component of any, I think, educated person's intellectual armamentarium, whatever their actual area of work may be, no matter how technical. A few words still about research and creativity. The European Common Research Space has had a number of frameworks. We're now into the 7th one. There have been evaluations of them, and last spring, the spring of 2009, a very interesting report was deposited about the 6th framework research program. So anybody linked to research, I really advise you to read that report very carefully. It has some extremely important conclusions. The committee I chaired last year looked concretely at the European Research Council, which was established very recently to create a common European space for investigator-driven free research of the highest possible excellence and highest level of quality. The various member states of the European Union, of course, each have their academies. They have their granting institutions. Countries like Germany have developed extremely strong and powerful and efficient mechanisms of supporting their researchers. Nokia was born in Finland, in the middle of the country at Jyväskylä, in a place where the government decided that a small university located there would be the center of an industrial research park, and the interaction between academe, industry, between theory and praxis, between applications and feedback from them and theory was crucial in the birth, the growth and the development of this so very successful multinational company. So the idea of putting resources in common at the European level, therefore, was the next step. If in 60 years ago, if coal and steel were put together, we had to wait till 2005 before the European Union was able to put together essentially a limited amount of money, 7.5 billion euros over that financial period going until 2014, to be spent on investigator-driven research, peer-reviewed, frontier research, as creative and as original as you can possibly imagine, with a very, very complicated system of peer evaluation, but with substantial support for those who actually made it, jumped through all the hoops and made it to the final selection process. Our recommendation as a committee, which was well received by both the Commission and the scientific community and political representatives, is that Europe has to continue doing precisely that. It has an Institute for Applied Research that Mr. Barroso was instrumental in creating. That, of course, needs to be developed. It needs much more pre-competitive applied research in the regions, and this is where I think your association, by looking to the Baltic region as one where certain regional interests can be best answered by pooling together resources, by creating clusters, where these clusters, for instance, I know my husband has been working in information technology. Creating a Baltic cluster or a regional one for Baltics and Scandinavia and its neighbors is a way of generating both intellectual sparks and innovation exchange, and it is one way of driving up the level the standards and the standards of excellence and the expectations of what should be done. I might mention that this very successful European Research Council, with its grants, looking at the criteria of excellence that they had produced, when you look at the map and see where the grantees will be going to a hosting institution, because in these grants, the grantee has to have a project that is excellent, but also an institution that is willing to accept them, to give them research space, and to handle the administration of that grant of 1 or 2 million euros, as the case may be. And what you see is a Europe divided by an invisible iron curtain. In other words, the successful grants are situated, clustered, in Western Europe and in the largest and richest countries. And the area to the east of it is almost black. This surely, as I kept pointing out to my colleagues, cannot mean that we have fewer bright minds to the east of the former Iron Curtain. It surely does not mean that our scientists are less gifted, less innovative and less imaginative. I know for a fact from my contact with them that in many cases, because of the difficulties they've gone through in their careers, they are more imaginative and more innovative. But there is a problem at the level of the European research space, of the criteria of excellence such as they are presented, such as, for instance, collaboration at the European level with first-grade research teams, etc., where you almost create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those who are in a circuit benefit from it, and they continue being in it, and the ones from Eastern Europe have difficulty getting into the A team and getting to first base. So that I think when I heard that the professional journal that you had created 3 years ago had achieved international acceptance and had an extremely high rate of rejection, I think that there's no other way to go about it. In whatever is being done in Central and Eastern Europe and in its neighboring countries, in our immediate neighborhood, has to be based on the criteria of excellence that are accepted elsewhere in the world, in those countries where research, free research has been going on for decades, where support for research has been much more continuous and much more generous than it has been. By the way, we note that Europe spends basically less on such research than the United States. The United States has a lot of private industry supporting research. In Europe, you have these national champions as the companies in France or Germany or Great Britain, but there's much less of this applied research, I think, involving companies large, small and medium in applied research is really a challenge, and I think particularly in our regions, small and medium companies are ones that should be looking to ways of using the latest in research and having a mutual feedback loop with institutions of higher learning in their region to tackle their specific problems, which in many cases are not identical to those that are faced with countries elsewhere in the world. So there are regional specifics to development that have to be taken into account. And this is why I'm very pleased to come here and to talk to you as people concerned with the development of this particular part of Europe. The introducing criteria of quality, of course, it rests on the culture, on the intellectual culture that one has. And when a culture has been different, it sometimes takes years to adopt to a different one. I know that people like Gundar Stjeniņš-Kings from Waterloo University, who came here to Latvia and used to lecture about management and did so well past his retirement, have emphasized how different the cultures are in the former communist countries. The attitude towards risk-taking, for instance, very much different because, of course, the systems encouraged it. But 20 years have gone by. A new generation is growing up. There are youngsters now entering the business world who never knew the old system. It's just old wives' tales to them, something they've heard from their parents and grandparents. So I think that we cannot no longer use this as an excuse for lagging behind in anything whatsoever, be it ethical standards, be it rates of innovation, be it number of publications for those people involved in teaching positions, quality of the materials used, etc., etc. I think 20 years, we should draw the line. That is enough. That's the period of grace we have had. We should, and I'm very glad at least that, of course, we have in many areas, we have been competing and very successfully right from the start. What we now have to do, I think, is to make sure that we are competitive across the line. That applies to Eastern and Central Europe in relation to the more established countries, but to the whole European Union as a whole in comparison to Brazil, which started investing in science and development in the 1980s. I was myself part of an international committee invited by the Brazilian Parliament to aid them in drafting a new constitution that would include articles about the need of the state to support research, education and innovation. And look at the result. Brazil is one of the growing countries and economies in the world. Same situation in India, which has invested in education research. Same situation in China, which is increasingly growing. We cannot afford to stay behind, rest on our laurels and continue as we've done before, because the world around us is changing. Crisis or no crisis, there are events happening elsewhere. One has to keep up and follow what is happening. One has to keep adjusting, and this is where the creativity comes in. Creativity means being able to analyze the situation at hand, able to detect changes and new trends in it, and then extrapolating from it, not just with empty mathematical models with 100 parameters, of whom maybe a handful are based on empirical observation, but on a much more focused attempt to link theory with practice, projection with observation, diagnosis with proposed cure. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me here, and I wish you all success in your endeavors. We need it all so that our societies can keep growing and fulfilling the needs and expectations of all their inhabitants. Thank you for your input into that.